The Morvanian Federation had elevated the conquest of lesser civilizations from crude military necessity into the galaxy's most sophisticated form of cultural expression, transforming systematic subjugation into performance art that occupied the same intellectual space traditionally reserved for philosophy and interpretive dance. Their masterpiece, converting the public execution of conquered military leaders into high-minded entertainment that satisfied both aesthetic sensibilities and academic curiosity, represented the pinnacle of civilized refinement that less evolved species could barely comprehend, much less appreciate. Chancellor Yexmora contemplated the evening's proceedings from her observatory within the Cultural Appreciation Complex orbiting Morvan Prime, her crystalline neural matrix processing audience engagement data with the satisfaction of a being who had successfully merged genocide with good taste. Tonight's scheduled termination of humanity's remaining military leadership promised to conclude what cultural critics across the galaxy had already declared the most intellectually stimulating conquest narrative in recorded history. The Federation's approach to galactic domination differed fundamentally from the barbaric methods employed by less sophisticated empires, where primitive species relied on overwhelming firepower and theatrical displays of superiority. Morvanians had developed an elegant system of cultural absorption that began with detailed anthropological study of target populations and concluded with their artistic integration into Federation cultural archives, or their aesthetically pleasing elimination if integration proved impossible. Humans had proven spectacularly resistant to cultural absorption, their chaotic value systems and irrational attachment to concepts like individual dignity making them fundamentally incompatible with refined galactic society. The entertainment value of their resistance efforts had more than compensated for the intellectual disappointment of their cultural inadequacy, however, providing the galaxy's finest minds with months of fascinating case studies in primitive behavioral patterns. Human military doctrine appears rooted in what they term adaptive improvisation, observed scholar Prime Tixevel, her tentacles manipulating holographic displays showing human strategic patterns. They actually modify established tactical frameworks based on situational variables rather than adhering to proven methodological principles. The cultural implications are quite remarkable from an anthropological perspective. What made human resistance so intellectually fascinating was their apparent inability to comprehend that warfare had evolved beyond the primitive concept of achieving victory to the more sophisticated goal of creating meaningful cultural dialogue through structured conflict resolution. Their documented attempts to achieve tactical objectives through unauthorized creative thinking had provided Morvanian academic institutions with countless examples of why adherence to established cultural norms was essential for civilized warfare. The execution amphitheater within the cultural complex had been designed according to strict aesthetic principles, its flowing organic architecture optimized to create the perfect synthesis of visual beauty and emotional impact, while maintaining scholarly observation standards suitable for cross-species academic analysis. The current configuration, calibrated for human physiological specifications, could process up to 36 individuals per hour, while preserving the contemplative atmosphere necessary for proper intellectual appreciation. Today marks the completion of Cultural Integration Project 7293, Comprehensive Resolution of Human Aesthetic Non-Compliance, Yexmora announced to her assembled Cultural Advisory Council, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a being who had never failed to transform military conquest into meaningful artistic expression. Here to tonight's proceedings, we can officially archive the human cultural experiment and redirect our scholarly attention toward more promising integration candidates. The preliminary executions of human generals had already provided weeks of fascinating cultural content, their deaths carefully choreographed and analyzed to create comprehensive educational materials for future anthropological studies. Each termination had been more artistically refined than the last, with the Federation's finest cultural directors working to optimize the aesthetic impact while maintaining the scholarly rigor necessary for legitimate academic documentation. Commander Attalus Pierce had been eliminated using Method 12 Gamma, a refined neural dissolution technique that ensured complete consciousness cessation within 6.2 minutes, while maintaining optimal psychological authenticity for academic observation. Captain Sage Winters had been processed via Method 18 Delta, involving systematic biological degradation that allowed for detailed study of human emotional responses while generating excellent scholarly engagement among researchers who appreciated psychological complexity. The current group represented humanity's final cultural loose ends, captured during what Human Command had designated a tactical repositioning initiative, but which Morvanian analysts had correctly identified as a complete strategic collapse. The humans' inability to distinguish between organized withdrawal and total organizational failure had simplified the cultural documentation process considerably. Major Dante Wolfe stood in the execution chamber, displaying the kind of quiet resignation that Morvanian psychological profiles had identified as typical pre-termination behavior in mammalian species. The humans' primitive neural patterns were completely accessible to Federation empathic monitoring systems, revealing the expected combination of fear, defiance, and psychological acceptance that made for optimal scholarly observation among academics who appreciated emotional authenticity. Do you have any final cultural contributions before we conclude your species' participation in galactic intellectual discourse? Yexmora inquired, her tone carrying the scholarly courtesy that audiences had come to expect from properly conducted cultural termination events. Wolfe looked directly into the primary documentation device, displaying none of the emotional breakdown that typically characterized failed resistance leaders. Earth submits its final cultural thesis, the human stated with inappropriate academic composure, before the neural disruptor reduced cognitive function to baseline levels. The scholarly approval ratings registered across all measurement parameters as the termination process continued with artistic precision. Each human death was documented, analyzed, and archived according to established cultural protocols, contributing to the Federation's comprehensive database of conquered species' final intellectual contributions. 5 hours later, the last human general had been processed, and Yexamora prepared to deliver her standard cultural completion report to the Galactic Academic Network. The broadcast would be distributed to every member institution as a routine update on Federation cultural achievements, with particular emphasis on the successful documentation of human intellectual limitations and the scholarly value generated by their resistance analysis. The transmission began precisely according to cultural protocols, with Yexmora's image appearing simultaneously across 1,847 academic centers. Her presentation on proper anthropological methodology and the fascinating futility of human cultural patterns proceeded without deviation from approved scholarly formats until an unauthorized communication somehow penetrated the Federation's secure academic network. Lieutenant Jade Raven materialized on screens throughout the galaxy, her human features displaying the kind of intellectual confidence that seemed completely inappropriate for a representative of an extinct cultural entity. The fact that she had somehow bypassed Federation security protocols should have been impossible, given that human technology barely qualified as primitive by Morvanian academic standards. Scholarly community of the galaxy, Raven began, her voice somehow accessing communication networks that should have been impenetrable to human technical capabilities. Humanity presents its final peer review. Your laughter has been documented and will receive appropriate academic response. The transmission continued despite frantic attempts by Morvanian technicians to regain control of their own systems. Protocol 0 is now active across all Federation installations. We trust you've found our cultural performance educational, because the academic curriculum is about to undergo significant revision. Yexamora's initial response was to classify the human's words as standard post-termination cultural expression, but that assessment became increasingly difficult to maintain as reports began arriving from across the academic network. Research installations that had operated flawlessly for centuries were experiencing comprehensive system failures. Orbital cultural centers were routing all communications through unknown academic relay points. Database networks were displaying research data that contradicted fundamental Federation scholarly records. The scope of simultaneous malfunctions across multiple star systems suggested something far more sophisticated than random technical difficulties. Morvanian cultural doctrine included no provisions for empire-wide intellectual infrastructure compromise, primarily because such an event required a level of systematic academic infiltration that no conquered species had ever demonstrated. "Chancellor," reported the chief research coordinator, her voice trembling with scholarly anxiety, "we are receiving cultural non-compliance reports from 1,634 systems simultaneously. Our documentation centers are recording engagement with human vessels that appear to possess research capabilities exceeding our analytical protocol." The revelation that humans had been systematically infiltrating Federation cultural infrastructure became apparent as scholars realized that their primitive subjects had been using deliberately obsolete technology throughout the conquest process. Every human defeat had positioned anthropological observers to study Federation cultural protocols. Every documented installation had been converted into a research station. Every executed general had carried carefully crafted misinformation about human intellectual capabilities. Allah Prime Tixavel examined the incoming analytical reports with growing academic horror. They'd been embedded in our research networks for decades. Every cultural study we published, every intellectual celebration we broadcast, they were documenting, analyzing, learning. The humans had accomplished something the Morvanian Federation considered academically impossible. They had allowed themselves to be conquered in order to conquer their conquerors. The species that appeared to lack basic intellectual sophistication had executed a multi-generational scholarly infiltration campaign that required sacrificing billions of their own people to establish cultural credibility. Professor Echo Sterling emerged from her position within the Federation Research Service, where she had spent 25 years posing as a loyal human cultural liaison. Her true identity as one of Earth's most decorated anthropological strategists had been protected by layers of academic documentation so sophisticated that even her own termination had been carefully staged to maintain her research integrity. "Surprised?" she asked Yexamura, her expression carrying none of the intellectual confusion the Chancellor had grown accustomed to seeing in studied species. "Your Federation eliminated human resistance in 18 months. Academically impressive. Humans eliminated your Federation in 50 years without triggering a single scholarly alert. The reversal was comprehensive and intellectually devastating. Morvanian cultural centers discovered that their human research assistants had been methodically compromising critical systems for decades. Communication networks that had carried Federation directives across the galaxy now transmitted human instructions to embedded researchers that had been waiting generations for activation protocols. Every aspect of Morvanian cultural superiority had been studied, documented, and systematically subverted by humans who had pretended to be too primitive to understand sophisticated academic procedures. "Your fundamental scholarly error," Lieutenant Raven explained during her second Galactic broadcast, this one considerably more triumphant than her initial cultural presentation, was assuming that a species capable of interstellar travel would be incapable of conducting long-term anthropological research. You studied our cultures while we studied your intellectual infrastructure. The academic establishment that had profited from human suffering discovered that their former subjects possessed a sophisticated understanding of cultural manipulation. The same networks that had broadcast human executions to trillions of scholars now transmitted comprehensive documentation of Federation atrocities to species across the galaxy who had been waiting for someone to challenge cultural dominance. Within 96 hours of Protocol Zero's activation, the Morvanian Federation's 3 millennia reign had collapsed completely. The species that had made entertainment from human deaths now found themselves facing the same cultural processing chambers they had constructed for their subjects' intellectual termination. Yexamura, stripped of her cultural authority and facing the same neural disruptor that had eliminated Major Wolfe, finally comprehended the true scope of human intellectual strategy. The generals who had died during those entertainment executions had volunteered for cultural processing, knowing that their termination would complete the research campaign that would eventually liberate not just humanity, but every species suffering under Federation cultural control. You planned this from initial academic contact, she realized, her crystalline neural matrix struggling to process the scholarly implications. Every defeat, every execution, every moment of apparent cultural failure, all components of a research methodology we never documented. Raven nodded, her expression carrying the same quiet confidence that Morvanians had interpreted as intellectual inadequacy. Your species perfected conquest through superior culture. Humans perfected conquest through superior scholarship. The ultimate irony was lost on no academic observer. The Morvanian Federation, for all its cultural sophistication and scholarly excellence, had been defeated by the same trait they had mocked in humans: the willingness to sacrifice immediate intellectual advantage for long-term research position. The species that had seemed too primitive to appreciate refined culture had proven too intelligent to be truly studied. As news of the Federation's dissolution spread across the galaxy, other species began reconsidering their assumptions about the unsophisticated humans who had somehow orchestrated the most successful academic deception in documented history. The beings who had laughed at human cultural incompetence now faced the uncomfortable realization that they had been watching master researchers pretend to be subjects. The lesson resonated throughout civilized space: never underestimate a species that treats research as an art form, especially when they appear to be failing spectacularly at basic cultural appreciation. Humans had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective conquest begins with allowing yourself to be studied, and that the greatest victories are achieved by enemies who never realize they're participating in their own cultural termination. In the end, the Morvanian Federation's 3 millennia dominance was concluded not by superior technology or cultural sophistication, but by humans who understood that in warfare, as in academia, the most dangerous opponents are those who make you believe you're studying them while they're systematically analyzing your entire intellectual structure. The galaxy would remember Protocol Zero as the day humanity taught the universe that intelligence comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous enemies are often those who know exactly how primitive they appear to be, while they're methodically documenting your civilization from within its own cultural framework. Those who had laughed while hanging the generals learned, rather too late, that sometimes the subjects have the last scholarly observation after all, and that proper academic methodology cuts both ways when implemented by someone who understands the difference between being studied and conducting research.